afternoon. I hope I'm not interfering with your lunch, but I love talking during lunch because all of you are happy, and I think what you're going to be hearing will also make you happy. My name is Kumar Ramanathan. I'm a senior director with Millennium Challenge Corporation. I don't know how many of you know Millennium Challenge Corporation, or MCC. MCC is a relatively recently established government foreign assistance corporation with the objective of providing a very specialized type of assistance that is different from the other typical donors in the space. We select our countries based on the qualifications of the country with regards to economic freedom, investing in people, because we believe that those countries can use the money that MCC provide for much better use than the countries that fail in those indicators. Today, we have a very special guest, Anne Pence, who was one of the founding fathers of MCC at the US government and then at MCC. So I'm privileged today to be in the presence of Anne after meeting after a very long time. Moving on from that, I suppose these are right. Just to give you a flavor, MCC, since its inception, has been working in water, sanitation, irrigation across the globe. We have worked in a number of countries, about 30 countries, since the inception, because our model is a model that is based on what the country identifies as a priority for economic growth and poverty reduction. It is not a supply push model. In other words, we would engage with a country when a country becomes eligibilized in order to find out what is that one single intervention that we can engage ourselves and provide funding for, which will have the biggest bang for the buck in terms of poverty reduction through economic growth. In some countries, it would be water. In some countries, it would be irrigation. In some countries, it could be electricity or power generation. In some countries, it can be health or education. So we don't know. We don't know what the demand is. And that, of course, puts a lot of challenges, let's say, in terms of staffing and capacity planning, etc. But it also is a very exciting model because each country, when it's eligibilized, will go through a systematic process to do those assessments and identify that intervention that is suitable for MCC assistance. And thereafter, we would go through a due diligence process to find out what is the best, what are the projects that would deliver that developmental objective that is identified by constraints analysis. So if it's a water topic, if water is the identified constraint for economic growth and poverty reduction, then the due diligence process delves deep into identifying how we can address the water problem in that particular country. I'm not going to go through all of the problems that we face in the global sector, in the global water sector. All of you know, I'm sure, we are covered with water, but the drinking water is only a small fraction of the water that we have in this world. And I think there has to be a recognition, and this is something that is coming from our partner countries, is that there is a recognition now that water is scarce. Even though we may see plenty of water, even in countries where there is a heavy rainfall on an annual basis, water is becoming scarce for various reasons. Access to water is becoming an issue. Access to water is becoming costly. Quality of water is deteriorating globally. And water for agriculture is becoming very scarce and highly questionable when water is scarce for municipal use, i.e. competing resources, a common pool resource. So all of these issues are emerging in many of our partner countries. And as a result, we are going to see some of these issues getting worse and worse. Why? Because of the climate change impact overlay on already stressed sector, water sector, both for consumptive use as well as for irrigation use. Climate change is a wild card. You don't know how it's going to impact in certain country, in a certain region within the country, and for what purpose, and therefore how we should plan our investments, not only to meet the demands today, but also to satisfy the sustainability in the future. One of the characteristics of MCC investments, as Sam knows, is that we subject our investments to scrutiny, and we need to justify the economics behind it, the cost and the benefits behind it, as well as the sustainability behind it. So when we take the project to the investment committee and get it passed through the board, we have to demonstrate that we have responded to the changing conditions of the project. So if we are doing a project in Tunisia, how Tunisia is going to be impacted in the future by climate change, and are we adapting to that requirements, not only just now, but also in the future, which makes it a challenge when we are trying to do a project or develop a project within 2 years. So the typical water and sanitation assistance that we have provided, keeping in mind, it's all country-led, it's all driven by the constraints analysis, but just looking back, what we have done, it is primarily either to reduce the disease burden, which means we can invest in sanitation, also improve the quality of water and the sources of water. It has been in the area of addressing water shortage in cities, in regions, addressing water needs for irrigation, because that has been the binding constraint, for irrigation to be expanded or productivity to be improved, and also to reduce the cost of the water so people can afford, and the governments don't have to spend more and more of their money in a tight fiscal regime for the supply of water. These are some of the areas that typically repeat in our partner countries as to why water is identified as a binding constraint. And the solutions we provide is not only infrastructure, because obviously infrastructure is important if it's a water supply project, but also the associated sustainability measures that go with the infrastructure. So we do due diligence on the policy, regulatory regime, and try to address the foundations that are needed to place this large investment that we are providing to the government, so that once we leave, it can be operated and maintained in a sustainable fashion without harming the environment, without excluding poor people, and without excluding the vulnerable population. Let me give you 2 examples just to illustrate the type of projects that we do and how we bring technology in addressing the problem that has been identified in these 2 countries. The first country is Mongolia. Mongolia went through the constraints analysis process and it identified the biggest constraint that they have towards the economic growth and poverty reduction of the country is the imminent water supply shortage in the capital city of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar. It was running out of water because the city has been growing rapidly and it has becoming industrialized. 4 power plants were established within a very short time in order to meet the power supply requirements of the city, which was the largest consumer of water, which makes even water more scarce for municipal use, even though the population has been increasing. So no wonder the supplies were outstripped by the demand and the future demand prospects. Add to that is the climate change problem. I think everyone knows Mongolia is impacted by global warming, and as a result, there have been issues with regards to both groundwater as well as surface water, especially the seasonality of that and the quantity like that. So the easiest way anyone could have provided more water to a city that is facing an imminent water supply shortage is to expand the existing well fields, the groundwater well fields that the city had upstream of the arterial river that runs through the city. That is the river, and it would have been easier to have exploited water supply sources upstream by expanding the existing well fields as well as establish new well fields. It would have been less costly, and it would have been the most beneficial for the government because it's easy for them to operate and maintain because they already have an institution set up to provide that service up north. When we did the, in fact, that is the proposal of the country. The proposal of the country is for MCC funding to expand the northern well fields. When we did our due diligence, we identified, had we developed these fields, we actually caused a significant damage, irreparable damage for the river and the groundwater because of climate change, because of the changing river patterns, changing flows, and the snow melt, etc. It is going to pose a significant problem if we were to even provide 1 cubic meter withdrawal from those existing well fields. And the ecology that is underpinning the river system is going to be at risk. So we looked at other alternatives, and the alternative that we chose, we looked at lots of alternatives, including groundwater injection, artificial aquifer recharge, but the one that we chose was downstream, to expand the downstream wells. Now, there's a problem with the downstream wells. There's a central wastewater treatment plant, which was a dysfunctional treatment plant, which was polluting, significant pollution for many decades. As Ulaanbaatar became industrialized, you can go on Google Earth and see that it's blue and then it's red. So that's how badly polluted the river was. So our solution was, that is the area where we can actually tap into more water, groundwater sources, polluted groundwater sources, to provide more water, if without having to be subjected by climate change impacts. It is climate change adaptable because it has got plenty of water, and we will not violate any kind of aquifer performance characteristics if we were to go down. So what we did was to make sure, establish a new central wastewater treatment plant that is compliant with the discharge standards, establish wells downstream, and put a reverse osmosis plant to purify that water and then hook onto the municipal system. That is on the supply side. And then the biggest consumers, as I mentioned, are the power plants. So to address the demand side, we added a recycling plant to the wastewater treatment plant and purified that water, supplied the treated wastewater to the power plants, and tell them to use that policy change, regulatory change, legal change, to mandate them to use that, and then release the fresh water, large quantities of fresh water that these power plants are using for municipal consumption. So we addressed both the supply side and the demand side. And as a result, we would be providing, at the current growth rate, 23 years more of water sufficient for 23 years worth of demand, both on the consumption, the consumer side, as well as on the industrial side. Let me give you another example, which is in Jordan. No surprise, Jordan's primary constraint is water. It's a country, I believe it's the 5th poorest country in terms of water resources. And the problem there is to provide water to a rapidly increasing second largest city in Jordan, Zaka. And this is the challenge. How do you find more water in a country that doesn't have water? We can go farther and farther to provide to access water, which makes the water enormously expensive, and it's essentially adding to the fiscal hemorrhage of the already fragile financial position of the country. So how do you do this? What our due diligence identified that large quantities of water, just like in the case of Mongolia, is being used by farmers in Jordan Valley. Large quantities. And that is potentially a source to tap into. So what we did was we established a formal sanitation collection network in Zaka. We only had 20% before we came in. We did 100% coverage of the sanitation collection network, collected the wastewater from the city that needed water. We expanded the centralized wastewater treatment plant to a tertiary level, and then sent the treated wastewater to Jordan Valley. Made a policy change for the farmers to use, mandate them to use for certain types of agriculture, release that water, bring it back to Zaka and provide it to people. And that we were able to recycle 80% of the wastewater generated in Jordan, and we were able to provide 15% of traditional water supply to in the future. So these are some of the examples, just to give you a flavor, the type of projects that we are doing, which are obviously large in scale and deep in scope, because it's very important to alleviating a particular problem. But the challenges that we face in trying to provide these type of projects under uncertainty. One of the biggest uncertainty is climate change, and how we are. I hope I have given you a flavor of how we try to address that uncertainty by doing a rigorous analysis in terms of what might be the future condition. All of this need to be done. You can blame and for that has to be done within 5 years. That's our model. Our model is that it's a 5-year engagement. These type of projects, even to do it in the United States, will take about 10 to 12 years. I love it. I think that gives an objective for purpose, a planning tool for us to say, how do we do these kind of mammoth large projects and get them implemented in countries where there is capacity, not like in the United States. Contractors that we don't know about, COVID on top of that. How do we do these things within 5 years? That is the challenge, and that's, I believe, is our problem.
Sure, you can handle it.
Yeah. There are questions, observations, comments?
Could you speak to the social, cultural challenges of getting communities to recycle water in any form?
Thank you. Very good question. Not only societies, let me start with industries first. The challenge is to create any change. Any change is going to be resistant because people are comfortable. That's a natural human tendency. Trying to change engineers from their ingrained practice. Oh my God. So it is a very systematic process. In the case of Mongolia, what we did was to bring in the nationally acknowledged, renowned hydrogeologists together. We formed a forum. We call it the expert committee. And that expert committee was speaking on behalf of the country in terms of the selection of the projects, the selection of technology, and the policy and legal changes that need to be brought in as part and parcel of those changes. So there was an expert committee for the recycled wastewater plant. And they are then, once they have approved it, they are well respected in the country. We use them to reach out to the other engineering community as well as the power plants. Power plants are the biggest opponents because they want to give up their fresh water. It's the fear of the unknown, right? It's not because they are against recycled water, but they don't know what the recycled water would do. Is the anti-scalants do we need to use? Is there a corrosion problem? Is there an alkalinity problem, right? They don't know that. So we have to go through all of that process. We bring examples from the United States where the US has gone through all this, right? We bring in experts from the US, from DC Water, right? In order to talk to them and exchange information about it's not bad. As long as you have got the water chemistry right, you can, this is purely harmless. It's not going to give you a scaling problem. And once you have gone through that process, it becomes much easier. And then you create the legislation. Don't create the legislation and try to convince them. Convince them and then do not just let it change.
Thank you. I think we'll know we've made it when the word wastewater is enough. When we don't have that word.
Yeah.
Because it's the wrong idea, right?
Yes.
Wastewater. It's to whether you will evaluate it as an option, air-cooled chillers, or the traditional power plants, and anaerobic digestion to support losses. Whether you thought about that and excluded it.
Sorry, can you repeat the last?
Yes, and then anaerobic digesters to account for the deficit from the air-cooled chillers.
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. We do. Yeah. So we go through, typically we go through all of the technological options in order to make an assessment of what is right. One of the challenges is it's not just the technology, right? It is also what is appropriate for the country. So, for example, we have a project in Timor-Leste right now, where for the first time, as you know, Timor-Leste has had it's still national, and therefore it is in the process of establishing a sector. For the first time ever, they put together a water utility 2 years ago. Right? And in the process, they are now building a capacity locally to be able to take on the responsibility of the water utility for both water supply and sanitation. But coming to the point that you're making, we are providing assistance, and part of that assistance is to build wastewater treatment plants. Now, what level of treatment that you have to undertake? Right? If we were to do a wastewater treatment plant like a tertiary plant, there's no way they can operate it. And on top of that, we put a biogas generator and all of that things. We will go, and that's it. That's going to be the end of that plant. We have seen that in other countries. So it is important to bring the right technology for the country to be able to take on in terms of operations and maintenance burden, because we are requiring them to put the funding and the financing that is needed in order to be able to receive that asset and to be able to operate. So in some countries, we purposely dial down on the technology.
Just to follow up on that, you said that when you leave these places, of course, you want them to continue to operate it. I've had the same experience as you, that when you leave a turbine and they don't maintain it, turbines go down, you can't bring them back up, that kind of equipment. What do you do and how do you assess in these places how much you can bring them up a level in terms of capacity, and what institutional structures have to change to allow them to continue to operate this, more modern or newer infrastructure efficiently over time, especially, they have regime changes and so on. So how do you decide I'm not going to use the kind of technology that Elise was referring to when I'm going to dial it down And in what case would you decide, no, I think they can handle it and we're going to leave them with something quite a bit more advanced than what they currently have? How do you figure that out?
Thanks, Dan. So two responses. One is one of the early due diligence that we do is the country capacity, the institution that is finally going to take over the asset once we have constructed for operations and maintenance. We do a diagnosis of what their capability, what the weaknesses are, what the deficiencies, and that's going to be part and parcel of the compact or the assistance that we provide as to how we are going to address that deficiency. Almost in every country that we have provided assistance to a utility or a regulator or both, we have to provide assistance to upgrade their skills. In Mongolia, the one that I just talked about, this is the first time they're going to have a reverse osmosis plant in the country. It's the first time there's going to be industrial wastewater recycling. So obviously, even though they have fantastic water engineers there and hydrogeologists, they don't know about these new technologies from an operations perspective. So to address that gap, once we have identified what those gaps are, and to address those gaps, there are three things we can do. One is partner with other donors to make sure that we are crowding in people to provide capacity building and institutional strengthening, both at the regulator level as well as at the utility level, because MCC is a 5-year engagement. After that, we are gone. There has to be someone providing assistance on a longer term basis, because this is a long-term capacity development for the utility. So that's the first thing we do, is to try and bring in other donors together. The second thing we do is to make provisions within the compact wherever we can upgrade the institutional knowledge to support the new technologies that we are providing. We provide funding for formal training, for visits to other countries. I think in the earlier session, we were talking about training arrangements. In Mongolia, we're doing a training arrangement, and that solicitation is going out right now. And also, in some cases, bringing in private operators to take on the operations and maintenance responsibility as soon as the plant is commissioned, but with the dual purpose of training the local staff, let's say for 5 or 10 or whatever the number of suitable period. So these are some of the sort of measures that we try to bring in so that they are not left high and dry once we leave. An important part of that is the funds needed for the operations and maintenance should be made available. It's a very common practice, as you know, in developing countries, for expecting the water utility to subsidize. That should stop. The water utility cannot subsidize if it has to take on the responsibility for full operations and maintenance, as well as asset depreciation costs. So keep the utility financially whole, but the subsidies that should flow from the government. So we undertake that financial analysis as part and parcel of our due diligence. We make that as a condition, whatever that condition might be, as a condition for signing our assistance, and we will monitor the government's adherence to that condition in order to make the utility financially whole and to continue to provide subsidies for the needed people through the appropriate ministries. And after we leave, it's the U.S. Embassy that launches that.
One last question. You have shared some wonderful examples of projects where water availability was a constraint to growth and identified as a priority. Are you also seeing other kinds of water resilience be identified as constraints to growth by our partner countries, like flood resilience or sea level rise? And is the compact structure well suited to address those forms of water resilience?
Yes. We are working in island countries where sea level rise has emerged as a large constraint with regards to not only tourism related activities, but also in terms of biodiversity and the cost, the fiscal cost in addressing that. But we have also, you mentioned flooding. Flooding has been devastating. Flooding was identified as a huge issue, which not only relates to the poor drainage structures, which incidentally is linked to sanitation as well, because people were draining their sludge straight into drains. But also in terms of the channeling of the water, whether it's river improvements or whether it's hillside improvements, all of that is contributing to unfortunate flooding, which, as you may know, has killed several people 4 years ago, and then once again repeated, killing people 2 years ago. So flooding is becoming a major issue in countries where flooding was never an issue, like in the case of Timor-Leste. It used to flood, but it never used to kill people. Now the intensity and the frequency are such. In the case of Timor-Leste, it's not necessarily the intensity that's changing, it's the frequency. So how quickly you are having these rainfall because of the saturated soils, which is actually creating the flood. So yes, that is becoming an issue. Very hard to solve flooding problems in a country in 5 years. Very, because you are disrupting the entire city to give a comprehensive solution. Right? We can improve a little bit here, a little bit there, but that's not going to do anything.
Kumar, you didn't address it explicitly, but obviously there has to be some private sector contractors and others who work in these environments. Do you want to tell the group a little bit about how you're drawing upon private sector water expertise to undertake these kinds of major investments?
Sure, yes. So when Anne created NCC, it was intentionally created to be small because we wanted MCC to be able to leverage the already available expertise in the United States. So we obviously need to partner with, particularly with the US service providers in the private sector, whether it's technology, whether it's construction, whether it's engineering, whether it's environmental, social people who know about finance. We bring them early on as our partners, our backbench, because we are a small organization. We need those expertise. Putting together a reverse osmosis plant or water supply, this water recycling means a lot of preparation, assessments, analysis, technologies need to be assessed, etc. And we bring all of these people into the preparation phase to advise us, to help us, to supplement our resources, and to prepare the projects and take it to our board, approve it, and then once it's approved, to help us with the implementation. 5 years, once that train started moving, our 5 o'clock is ticking. We have 5 years to finish this project. We cannot spend one extra day beyond the 5 days. It's legally mandated. So the only option is either you finish the bridge in 5 years, or you return a half-finished bridge to the country. Obviously, half-finished bridge has got all sorts of consequences, so we go for the first option. And in order to do that, you need all the assistance that you need from a wide community of private sector with different skills to help us implement that as soon as possible within that time.
I just have a follow-up question on that. When we involve in non-violent workforce and NCC, the United States steps into another country, working on numerous projects. You just gave the example of flood resilience, or kind of rehabilitating a community or an entire city that's been affected by flash floods. 5 years is too short time period to kind of reconstruct it or even start getting things off the ground. What's a buy for stakeholders, all levels, to come to MCC, help them, facilitate them, and allow the things to kind of move and be mobilized on the ground, whether it's the private sector, for example, Jordan, just give an example, they have notorious plumbing problems, a lot of issues that they can benefit from as well from an external agency coming in and helping. But there's a lot of conflict with that as well. People they don't readily accept external help, especially sometimes when it comes to the United States, unfortunately. So how do you work around that? I'm very curious about the engagement process.
Good question. So I think the best way I can answer, I hope I will answer your question. Let's say the constraints analysis identified water sector as the main. Let's take the case of Jordan, right? Where we are trying to provide more water to South Africa. Of course, there is a laundry list of things that we would like to see the country change. Some of them are, which some of our sectors within MCC might very strongly feel that is necessary. I think we need to take a step back from that laundry list and say, which are the 5-10 things that must have in order to make sure that we are hitting the sustainability requirement. Right? It's like a Pareto curve. The 20% will deliver the 80% of the benefits. We cannot deliver the 100% that we would like that sector. So we try to focus on those critical reform items or behavioral change items or things that are important for the sustainability of the assets that we are going to be providing. When I say sustainability, operations, maintenance, the asset life, etc. And focus on those items. Right? It could be behavioral change, in which case we will make sure that we are putting the right kind of technical assistance to try and change people's behavior. Not a simple thing, but nevertheless, we need to do that in order for people to be able to benefit from that. So we have to engage those kind of things from using local people to tell local people. There's no point sending a bunch of Americans try to tell people in Jordan how to use their toilet, for example. So those kind of structures that we use, but more importantly, I think it's a dialogue with the government early on. Don't have that dialogue after signing the contract; it will never happen. So it's a carrot, right? You have this large investment package that you are grant money, free money that you are ready to give to the government, as long as the government meets these requirements. Some of them are prior to signing the contract, some of them are prior to disbursing the money, and the rest are conditioned upon disbursing the quarterly money during implementation. And it's an agreement that you reach with the government, and it's enshrined in the compact documents. It's a bilateral agreement between the United States and the country. But it's with the willingness of the country that you are doing. Some of them are very thorny subjects. Mm-hmm. Let me give you actually a funny story. So in Jordan, one of that discussion that we were having as part of our negotiations, compact negotiations, is the tariffs. Tariff levels need to be increased because it has never been increased in Jordan for maybe a century. But we now would like them to commit to a progressive tariff increase. So they agreed to that. The entire Council of Ministers agreed to that. The government agreed to that. The next day, the king pronounce, there shall be no child labor. He didn't know that we have already agreed to this. His government has agreed, and he made this proclamation just for popularity, obviously. And here we have a conflict, and then we had to get the king to back off from his statement. So those are, challenges we have.
Well, thank you, Kumar. We really appreciate